On the 11th of November at 5 a.m., an armistice was signed in 1918. The armistice brought a truce to the First World War. It's very interesting how that the truce came about. The 11th hour of the 11th day and of the 11th month, the ceasefire came into effect. 103 years ago, that took place. The war had begun in the 28th of July of 1914, and it ended on the 11th of November, 1918. In 1914, the European powers were divided into two coalitions: the Triple Entente, consisting of France, Russia, and Britain, and the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Well, as the war widened, things changed on the two sides. The Entente added Italy, who switched sides. So Italy came into to the Entente, and also Japan and the United States in 1917. The name changed from the Triple Entente to the Allied Powers. On the other side, the Ottoman Empire of the Turks, Asia Minor, and Bulgaria, they joined with Germany and Austria to create the Central Powers. Their name had been changed as well from Triple Alliance to the Central Powers. It led to the mobilization of more than 70 million military personnel, including 60 million Europeans, which made this one of the greatest wars in history. It is estimated that over 9 million combatants and 7 million civilians died as a direct result of this war. It is considered a contributory factor in a number of genocides and in the 1918 influenza epidemic, which caused between 50 and 100 million deaths worldwide. In this country, that war was called the War to End All Wars. But just over 20 years later, World War II would surpass World War I. It is estimated that 60 to 80 million people died in World War II. It's very interesting when you look at that statistic and Revelation 9, verse 17 and 18, where it talks of 1/3 of mankind being killed. Today, the world population is somewhere over 7.5 billion. And if that happened today, 1/3 of that population would be 2.5 billion. That would be over 2.4 billion more than the total estimated deaths of World War II. That's what the Bible says will happen even later. But when we look at these historic statistics, they are staggering to imagine how much took place at that time. I'd like to ask this question. Was World War I the beginning of the end times? I don't know, but I'm asking the question. This war saw new technological and industrial developments that man had never seen before that greatly increased the military and civilian losses. Heavy artillery, airplanes, submarines, tanks, machine guns, and chemical warfare all resulted in a greater loss of life than what man had experienced in war until that time. In the book of Daniel, chapter 12 and verse 4, it says, But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. Just a short little statement, knowledge shall be increased. And then in verse 9, and he said, Go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed until the time of the end. Well, knowledge certainly was beginning at that time. As far as the knowledge we see at this time, it has escalated ever since. At that time, the things I mentioned that man was learning about and using was primitive. But it did begin to slowly increase following that war. Did the seal in verse 9 on the book begin to be opened? I remember Mr. Armstrong believed that it was. He understood about the history and the great empires mentioned there in Daniel's time, and that we were in the end time because the seal was opened and revealed that it was not secret anymore about the book of Daniel. What else came from World War I that may signal it as the beginning of the end times? Well, today I would like to look at World War I and the end times. The modern Middle East today began after the end of World War I. Following the war, the Ottoman Empire of the Turks, which had ruled the Middle East for 400 years, came to an end. The Ottoman Empire had ruled from the Middle East to Persia, which today is Iran, and from North Africa to southeastern Europe at various times in those 400 years. I recall, I don't know if I gave it here or not, but one of the leaders, Suleiman the Great, in 1545 came to Jerusalem and he sealed the Eastern Gate. And because he believed that the Jews' prophecy that the Messiah would come through the Eastern Gate, he wanted to make sure that wouldn't happen. And if you go to Jerusalem, if you're on the Mount of Olives and you look across the Kidron Valley, and you see that the Eastern Gate is sealed, 1545, Suleiman the Great, to prevent the prophecy of the Messiah coming through the Eastern Gate. He was part of the then Ottoman Empire that was just in its beginning, 1545, back at that time. What else took place here? Well, the British, the French, and the newly formed League of Nations reshaped the entire Middle East. The nations of Iraq, Kuwait, Syria, Transjordan, and Turkey were formed. They were not there before. The Ottoman Turk Empire was out of Asia Minor, or what today is Turkey, but it was expanded beyond those borders previously. Egypt had been independent from the Ottoman Empire since before the 20th century began. Lebanon had been given some independent status under the Ottoman Empire back in the 19th century. Now, a number of these nations consist of the descendants of Israel and Judah's ancient enemies, such as Edom, Moab, Ammon, the Syrians, and the Philistines. We can't really distinguish one from the other. We many times have thought the Jordanians, because of their capital, Ammon, and Moab, that a lot of their descendants may be in that area of what was Transjordan. But in terms of end-time prophecy, the greatest event to come out of World War I was the Balfour Declaration. You probably have heard about it. You know, of course, a little. Well, let me read on here a little bit about it. On October 13th, 1917, the British cabinet authorized the Foreign Secretary, James Arthur Balfour, to issue the Balfour Declaration to give the Jewish people a national homeland in Palestine. I'd like to read just a little bit here from a book that a lot of material I have here today has come from. The title is Jerusalem by Simone Sebig Montefiore, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's quite an extensive book. I bought it because it's a history of Jerusalem from King David to the present. And there's a lot of interesting history, and of course I would like to talk a little bit about what happened in 1917 and what he writes here. As Allenby, that is General, that is General Allenby, British commander, massed his 75,000 infantry and 17,000 cavalry and a handful of new tanks, Arthur Balfour the British Foreign Secretary was negotiating a new policy with a Russian-born scientist named Dr. Chaim Weizmann. It is a remarkable story. A Russian immigrant wandering around Whitehall, that's where the various departments of the British government are in London, and dropping into the offices of the most powerful statesman in the world for romantic conversations on ancient Israel and the Bible. Managed to win the backing of the British Empire for a policy that would change Jerusalem as radically as any decision by Constantine or Saladin, one of the Arabs who took it back from during the Crusades, and define the Middle East to this day. A couple other things I want to read here, and then we'll move on. Once again, the Bible, Jerusalem's book, influenced the city over 2 millennia after it was written. Quote, "Britain was a biblical nation," wrote Weizmann. Quote, "Those British statesmen of the old school were genuinely religious. They understood as a reality the concept of the return. Not the return of Christ, the return of the Jews. It appealed to their tradition and to their faith. Along with America, Bible reading and Bible thinking England noted one of Lloyd George, that's David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, we'll come back to his name, noted one of Lloyd George's aides was the only country where the desire of the Jews to return to their ancient homeland was regarded, quote, as a natural aspiration not to be denied. Very interesting how this all came about. One other thing I want to add to it here, how it came about. Chaim Weizmann, who was leading the Zionist movement at that time from Russia, was a Russian scientist who came to London. Yet timing is everything in politics. In December of 1916, Asquith's government fell. He was the prime minister, and Lloyd George became prime minister, and he appointed Balfour as foreign secretary. Lloyd George was declared as the greatest war leader since Chatham, and he and Balfour would do whatever was necessary to win the war. At this vital moment in a long and terrible struggle with Germany, their peculiar attitudes to the Jews and the special, and this is a word I hadn't run into before, concatenation of circumstances of 1917 merged to convince Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, and Balfour that Zionism was essential to help British achieve victory, that they needed the British help in order to achieve that victory. The Allies, explained one of the key British officials, as for America, it, quote, was supposed American opinion might be favorable or favorably influenced if the return of the Jews to Palestine became a purpose of British policy. Balfour, about to visit America, told his colleagues that, quote, the vast majority of Jews in Russia and America now appear favorable to Zionism, and if Britain could make a pro-Zionist declaration, we should be able to carry on extremely useful propaganda both in Russia and in America. In other words, we need this in order to bring victory to the Allied powers. Now, that gives a historical explanation of what brought about the Balfour Declaration. But is that really the whole story? Can it all just be explained in physical terms of what was to take place and what did take place? Well, let me start with a few scriptures here, and you'll begin to see where I'm going with this. Let's turn to the book of Daniel, the 8th chapter. Daniel chapter 8. It is interesting looking at the history of what happened and what happened to the world following World War I, how things began to be reshaped. Not necessarily right away, but things were set in motion so they would. In Daniel chapter 8, verse 19, We have here the vision of the ram and the goat. We come down here, Gabriel's interpreting it, the angel Gabriel. But I just want to read verse 19. And he, Gabriel, said, "Look, I am making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation, Daniel. For at the appointed time the end shall be." Very interesting statement. At the appointed time the end shall be. Well, you know what? It doesn't end there. If we look a few verses over, let's go to chapter 10 and verse 1. Part of the longest prophecy in the Bible is Daniel 10, 11, and 12. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar. The message was true, but the appointed time was long. That is, the message, it was a long time before the true message is going to be fulfilled. It's what it's saying here. Look across the page there, chapter 11, and look at verse 27. Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table, but it shall not prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time. Well, that's 3 times we've seen that, isn't it? Drop down 2 verses. At the appointed time he shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. 4 times. Look at verse 35. And some of those of understanding shall fall to refine them, purify them, and make them white, until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. Very interesting about the appointed time and what is being said there or given to Daniel. Daniel is not just coming up with this. This is being given to Daniel by an angel from God. Now, in relation to the Jewish nation today, let's notice something, because if we go to Zechariah chapter 12, Zechariah chapter 12, and what does it say about the Jewish people and Jerusalem in the time of the end? Now, by the way, I should mention most all prophecies are dual. They have their first fulfillment, and then the second one is at the time of the end. Sometimes prophecies from the Old Testament are only half fulfilled. An example of that, without turning to it, is in Acts chapter 2, the prophecy of Joel that was, quote, fulfilled on the day of Pentecost. But if you read the prophecy of Joel, where the sons and daughters would prophesy and so forth, go back to Joel chapter, chapter 3, you'll see it's only half fulfilled. And the remainder of the prophecy obviously is for the second coming when Christ would return. But I want to turn here to Zechariah 12 and notice something. In let's start in verse 1. The burden of the word of the Lord is against Israel. Thus says the Lord, who stretches out the heavens, lays the foundation of the earth, and forms the spirit of man within him. Verse 2, behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of drunkenness to all the surrounding peoples when they lay siege against Judah and Jerusalem. And it shall happen in that day, what day? That day that I will make Jerusalem a very heavy stone for all peoples, all who would heave it away will surely be cut in pieces, though all nations of the earth are gathered against it. Verse 4, in that day, says the Lord, I will strike every horse with confusion and his rider with madness, and I will open my eyes on the house of Judah and will strike every horse of the peoples with blindness, and so on. As you read this 12th chapter, what do we see here? A Jewish state existing in the time of the end, right? And in control of Jerusalem. It's interesting, it all began with the Balfour Declaration. And I will show you in just a little bit, there were many attempts long before that simply failed to open up the Middle East for a Jewish state. Well, how strong would they be? Let's notice over here in Genesis 49, the prophecy that Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, and particularly here, what it has to say about Judah. This is Genesis 49. Now in verse 1, Jacob called his sons and said, "Gather together that I may tell you what shall befall you in the last days." Okay? We understand, and it certainly seems to be quite consistent throughout the Old Testament. The latter days, last days, it's the time when the Messiah returns. But what about Judah? Verse 8. "Judah, you are he whom your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's children shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He bows down, he lies down as a lion, and as a lion, who shall rouse him?" And then it goes on, verse 10, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah," that is the symbol of kingship, "nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh," which is the Messiah, until Christ comes, "and to him shall be the obedience of the people," or the obedience of the nations. So, yes, again, we see that Judah exists at the time of the end, right? Very interesting. In the last days, this is what we will have here from the Jewish people. Now, with all of this in mind, how the Balfour Declaration came about, hoping to bring the Jewish people and their influence that would encourage the Americans to be in on our side, and we could probably win the war. And without that, we may just come to a standstill and not get anything accomplished. But I'd like to look a little bit more, because it has been in the last days that the Jews were once again a nation in the land of Israel, in the Middle East, and in control of Jerusalem. But I'd like to look at history leading up to the Balfour Declaration. It has been the Christians in the past 350 years who have wanted the Jews to return to Jerusalem, to speed up the second coming of Christ. Many evangelicals today contribute great sums of money to the state of Israel. I recall watching Benjamin Netanyahu speak in San Antonio before John Hagee's megachurch down there. Thousands of people around there. Why was he speaking there? He was invited because they contribute. And why do they contribute? To help finance and to help the return, hopefully to build the temple so the abomination of desolation can take place and Christ can return, to speed it all up. People have been trying to speed up prophecy, and for the last 350, 400 years, various groups have. I'm going to go through a little bit of this here to show you what has been going on, because I don't care if you put billions into it unless it's the appointed time. It's not going to happen. The first, historically, 350 years ago, of trying to set up a homeland for the Jews to return to was the Puritans in England. In 1649, the Jews had been forbidden from residing in England, period. But there were two English Puritans, Joanna and Ebenezer Cartwright, who petitioned the government to repeal the ban and organized an effort to transport European Jews back to the Holy Land and restore the nation of Israel. They believed that they had to convert the Jews to Christianity and then transplant them to the Holy Land. To do what? Speed the return of the Messiah, of course, behind that. Jewish people were not allowed in England before 1649. And actually for a number of years later until they finally were, Parliament changed that. But this was the kind of the beginning historically, the mid-17th century, but it was not in God's time. It all came to nothing. The next effort came with the Jews in Europe and Prime Minister Oliver Cromwell. In the mid-1600s, Manasseh ben Israel a respected rabbi in Amsterdam, became convinced that the first step toward the fulfillment of Israel's rebirth was immigration to England. I thought that was very interesting when I read that. Not to Russia, not to Germany, but to England. Oliver Cromwell, who was caught up in the prophetic fervor and interested in Manasseh's proposal, exhorted Parliament to aid in the restoration of the Jewish nation. Cromwell's reasons were also for strategic and economic reasons related to his war with Holland and Portugal going on at the same time. Parliament disagreed with Cromwell, but they did lift the ban on Jewish immigration to England. England became a haven for Jews during and after England's war with Spain in 1656. But again, it was not the appointed time for there to be a Jewish homeland in the Middle East. Next, historically, there was Sir Isaac Newton. You've all probably read about Sir Isaac Newton, scientist and so forth, and that's what you remember of him was his science. I've got a couple of his books on calculus and things like that. Very interesting. He lived between 1643 and 1727. He was a British scientist who spent a lifetime, which I did not know, studying prophecy and believed in the literal interpretation of prophecy. At the end of his life, he said, quote, "About the time of the end, a body of men will be raised up who will turn their attention to the prophecies and insist on their literal interpretation in the midst of much clamor and opposition." Well, the appointed time was not in his generation, obviously, but what he said has certainly come to pass in our time. And the time of after the Balfour Declaration even, a little bit of British history through the 20s and 30s, and maybe in just a little bit. Well, it wasn't in the time of Sir Isaac Newton. He had a very keen interest in it. Then it's interesting, another one came along, but he was not British. He was not French either, but his name was Napoleon. And he was from the island of Lombard, or the area of Lombard, which was northern Italy, but from, Sardinia, I believe was where he came from, actually the island there. Young general, became a young king and emperor of France. In 1798, he arrived at Acre, or Akko in the Hebrew, where the Eighth and Final Crusade had ended 500 years earlier in 1291, and even at that time was led by a French king. Napoleon had promised his Jewish financiers that he would capture the Holy Land and establish a state of Israel for the Jews. Some of his financiers, I think, go back to the Rothschilds and others in Paris. But Napoleon, there's a problem. This is almost comical. Napoleon's cannons, in order to take the fortress at Acre, were captured by British Admiral Lord Nelson while they were being transported from Alexandria, Egypt, to Joppa, and on the, of course, Israeli Mediterranean coast. It resulted in Napoleon being bombarded by his own artillery, and he had to give up the fight and he had to withdraw. Once again, it shows man cannot make it happen if it is not the appointed time. Sounded like a great plan. And really, it seemed like Napoleon, now had he got his ships from the cannons from Egypt over to Joppa, he could have marched into Jerusalem. The British wouldn't have been able to do much. But like Churchill said, there's an unseen hand here somewhere, referring to the actual things that took place in World War II. Next came the 19th century. A number of British evangelicals were influenced by Napoleon's promise to conquer Palestine and, quote, restore the country to the Jews. The British Protestant Bible prophecy movement continued through the 19th century. It led to Lord Balfour's declaration in 1917. Also in the United States, evangelicals were calling for a Jewish state in Palestine in the 19th century. Benjamin Disraeli, British Prime Minister, and who was also a Jewish convert to Christianity, captured Cyprus for Britain, and he purchased the Suez Canal. Very interesting. He also went on to say that he believed that the Holy Land for the Jews was just a matter of time. Well, he was right about that. It was just a matter of time. The British were close, but it wasn't quite the time. But it was getting close. Finally, we come to the 20th century and Lord Balfour. Arthur James Balfour was England's foreign minister under Prime Minister David Lloyd George during World War I. He believed religion and civilization in general owed Judaism, quote, an immeasurable debt, shamefully ill-repaid. After meeting Chaim Weizmann, the leader of the Zionist movement, he set out on a personal mission to not only bring the Holy Land back to life, but, quote, do something material to wash out an ancient stain upon our own civilization, end of quote. Interesting how he also felt about it. His efforts succeeded because the appointed time had come. It's very interesting when you look at every one of the movements for 350 years coming up to the Balfour Declaration at the end and during the time of World War I. 1917 is interesting because it was 2,520 years from 604 BC when the Babylonians first besieged and led Jewish captives from Jerusalem. And if you're familiar with the times that are mentioned in the book of Leviticus chapter 26 there in the prophecies, 7 times more, 2520 is 7 times a prophetic year of 360. And is it just a coincidence? Well, interesting that we see that number there. And it does, when you go back 2,520 years, you come to 604 BC. Even though this was established for nationhood, yet it would not come actually until May of 1948. Jerusalem was captured in June of 1967. That's a long time. That's 50-some years since the Balfour Declaration, isn't it? That will be 55 years ago this coming June. I had finished my freshman year in college. I recall everybody was watching that in the news. We didn't have the news like they have available to us today. Can you imagine? We had all the news networks and the 24/7 news programs and everything going on. All kinds of things were speculated. There were religious groups thinking the Jews were preparing to build the temple. The Jews were not preparing to build the temple. In fact, Moishi Dayan, the general who led the way in, offered to the Arabs an olive branch. They could have control of the Temple Mount and manage the things that are on the Temple Mount in order to keep peace. Now, of course, the Orthodox Jews, they wanted to be able to come in and clean it off and build a temple. No, but the government of Israel would not allow it at that time and never has ever since, hasn't even, as far as I know, I've heard even gotten close to it. Religious groups in this country were saying that they were having special marble cut out of a quarry in Indiana to go over there to build the temple and everything. I recall, which we didn't believe it, but all kinds of things were circulating around. This was it. This was it. And they were sure of it. But no, it wasn't. It was not yet the appointed time. And 55 years have gone by since that took place, or will be this coming June, in about 6 months from now. What is yet to come? Keeping some of this in mind. What was told to Daniel by Gabriel, the prophecies were given to him, and then he was given interpretations to some of it. And but we came back to the appointed time, Daniel. It's not yet. And when we look and see how, yes, there is a prophecy in Zechariah, there would be a Jewish state in which the Jewish people would be in control of Jerusalem. Zechariah, the 12th chapter. And it is there today. But even after the declaration, the Balfour Declaration, it has taken how many years? Till 1948, until 1967, 50 years before Zechariah 12 could begin to be fulfilled in the time of the end. Now, going on, let's look at some of the things that are yet to take place. Let's go to Daniel chapter 11. Just a few things here. In Daniel 11, and verse 40 through 41. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him, like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships. He shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through, and he shall also enter the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape from his hand: Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon, or Ammon, whichever. The king of the north, representing certainly from Europe, will overcome the Jewish state. Or will it have already been overcome? I don't know. This is going to take place. The king of the north will come after the king of the south has first attacked him. How much time in between? How much time in between? Sometimes we might get excited and think it's immediately. Well, maybe it will happen immediately. Can't say it wouldn't. But if we look, we have to realize it is at the appointed time when any of this will take place. The people that will escape, are they given authority to administer the land? The Jews, apparently, well, they're removed. They go into captivity. And we see in the 14th chapter of Zechariah. Today, that seems inconceivable. Excuse me. Why? Because the Jewish state is a regional superpower in its own right. It has the most advanced weaponry, and it has the will to use it that the United States could give it or sell to it. And even now, they may be looking at how they can possibly reach Iran to take out its nuclear capabilities and return safely back to Israel. Very clever. And in times they have been blessed in many ways. You look at 1976, we're celebrating 4th of July. And I hear on the TV about the Israelis going down into the Red Sea to Uganda to rescue people who had been hijacked on a French airliner that was flying to Israel, and many Jews were on that plane. And an incredible rescue took place. We saw the movie that was made, I think it was an Israeli company that made the movie. It's very interesting. But there are many things that they've been able to do. Now, something's going to have to change. And we should be watching and to be aware of these things. The Lord has not delayed his coming. We put our timetable on things when we get excited. The clock is ticking, and it's on time, his time. Let me notice here again, or just comment again. We have not yet seen the king of the south attack Europe, or Europe counterattack, come across North Africa and head to the glorious land. As I've said before, Mr. Armstrong saw that in World War II. He would always go up, look at the ticker tape before Sunday morning going on radio station, while it was in Seattle, to see what was going on. When he saw Rommel crossing North Africa, didn't he represent the king of the north? And of course, later he would be stopped by Montgomery at Al Alamein, and he would have to retreat. And of course, the Allies would go from there to Sicily, Sicily into Italy, moving toward Germany. But you can see why he thought at that time. How many years ago was that? 80 years ago, back in the in the 40s, would that be 1940? And when that took place, because he saw that. But it wasn't the time. Maybe it was a forerunner of what would come in the time of the end when we look at this. Now let's go over to Luke 21, Luke chapter 21. And verses 20 through 24. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Would that not be when the king of the north crosses the Mediterranean, North Africa, and comes into the glorious land? I would think it would be the same. Is there dualism in it, in the prophecy? Now you find in the 11th chapter of Daniel, which I didn't explain when we were there, but you have a continuous battle between the king of the north and the king of the south in the Middle East. The king of the north being the Seleucid Empire out of Damascus, the king of the south being the Ptolemy Empire out of Egypt. Back and forth, treacherous marriages and killings and assassinations and all of that. But then the prophecy steps beyond that period of time into the time of the end, and is talking about a different king of the north, a different king of the south, and that it'd be a time when they would come in and surround Jerusalem. Jerusalem has been surrounded, by the way, I should say, more than once. This prophecy here took place in 70 AD, didn't it? Jerusalem was surrounded by the king of the north, the Romans, Titus. And quite a miracle how the church that was trapped inside the walls was able to go out and up to a place called Pella, northeastern Israel today, southwestern Syria, I guess, right there on the border, and to a place of safety for them at that time, because Titus had withdrawn his troops back. All the Jews thought these church members, were crazy. No, they believed what the angel said at the temple there in Jerusalem at that time. Okay, let me get back here to this. Luke chapter 21, let's go to verse 21 and verse 21. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. And that's what it says in Zechariah 14. They're going to be coming in and ravage everything and be led away, and Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. That time is, yes, indeed, coming. It happened once in 70 AD. It will happen in a greater extent at the appointed time, in the time of the end. Now let's come over here as we see a little bit of what's happening and what has led up to the Jewish people having the Jewish state controlling Jerusalem. There are things yet, the abomination of desolation we're told of in the Olivet prophecy. When you see that take place, how is that going to take place? Well, for one thing, this army that comes across North Africa into the glorious land and surrounds the city, obviously is going to get control of it and set up an abomination. But there's no temple. And then the question is, do you need a temple? What happened when the captives came back from the Babylonian captivity? They started to rebuild the temple, second temple. They had the altar outdoors set up. I believe it was in 535. They had the altar, then they stopped building the temple. Until 720 when Haggai and Zechariah come back. And they really got on them for building their homes and taking care of them and leaving this house bare and open. But for 15 years, sacrifices took place on the altar always is outdoors, even if the building of the temple is complete. The altar sits out in the open in front of it. So that continued to go on. My point there is that what's going to happen? Something to think about. I can't say one way or the other. I just know that Christ is going to build a temple when he returns. We read about that in Ezekiel. And it's going to be one fabulous temple indeed. Will that be the third temple or the fourth temple? You read carefully the wording. When you see the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not, what's that mean? That leaves a little interpretation there, or a little, it's not totally clear. It doesn't say when you see it standing in the temple, where you see it standing where it ought not to be. Mark 13. Also, Matthew 24, the Olivet prophecy there. The article is important to consider. A holy place or the holy place. Just things to be aware of. In other words, we should not just set our mind on certain things and say, well, this is the way it's going to be. Wait a minute, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. But we need to really look at things that may be happening just a little different than what we sort of imagined in our mind all through our years that it would. Now let's look here. I'm going to finish up at Luke 21 and verse 34 and 30 through 36. But take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, the cares of this life, that day come on you unexpectedly. For it will come as a snare on all those who dwell on the face of the whole earth. Well, why? Everything's like it always has been, like in the days of Noah, Matthew 24 says, and people can go to sleep. Verse 36, watch therefore and pray always that you may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass and to stand before the Son of Man. Now, pray always that you may escape, or pray always by praying to stay close to God. It may be both. It may be both. Not just praying that we will be saved, but praying what? For the church, our brethren. And like the things that are happening right now, that Colorado, Kentucky, all these things, we need to be praying and praying for one another. And yes, watching for these things. Matthew chapter 24, I do want to go to a couple verses to finish on over here. It blends in here with Luke 21. In Matthew 24, notice verse 48. But if that evil servant says in his heart, my master is delaying his coming. Now, when I talk about the appointed time it is not that the Lord has delayed his coming, because he has not. He is right on time, and we may be surprised when that will take place. There are a number of appointed times yet to be fulfilled. While we're there, look up at verse 42. Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. We do not know the appointed time, do we? We do not. So it's very important here that we keep these things and all of this in mind. We're certainly not going to get, I know you wouldn't, get caught up in what modern Protestantism is doing and trying to speed it up by giving more money to the state of Israel and hoping they will somehow will build either the altar out there on the Temple Mount or the temple itself in order to speed the return of Christ as they are thinking. Well, what we see unfolding today in the Middle East began over 100 years ago, during and at the end of the war to end all wars. Now, there are yet appointed times to be fulfilled before Christ returns on the prophecies that we have been given. Well, brethren, we must never slumber and sleep, as the scripture shows and as Christ taught, but we must, as he taught, watch and be prepared, because we do not know the appointed time.